On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a man named Gerald Kowalski drove his pickup truck down a gravel road in Dubuque County, Iowa, and pulled to a stop at the edge of what used to be his neighbor's farm. He sat there for a long time with the engine running and his hands on the wheel, looking at the for sale sign that had been pounded into the frozen ground at the end of the driveway. The sign had a realtor's name on it, a phone number, and a price that made Gerald's stomach turn. $40,000 for 160 acres of some of the best bottomland in the county, a barn that had stood since 1911, and a house where 3 generations of the Martin family had been born, worked, and died. $40,000. Gerald Kowalski sat there until the heater fogged the windows, and then he put the truck in gear and drove home without saying a word to anyone. Let me tell you about the Martin farm, because you need to understand what it was before you can understand what almost happened to it and what was found underneath it. The Martin family had farmed that particular stretch of ground in Dubuque County since 1903, when a man named August Martin arrived from Wisconsin with a draft horse, a pregnant wife, a trunk of tools, and enough saved money to put a down payment on 160 acres of river bottom ground that nobody else wanted because it flooded every 3rd spring. August wanted it because of the flooding. He understood something that the land speculators didn't, which was that ground that floods every 3rd year's ground that gets new topsoil deposited on it every 3rd year. And if you were patient enough to work around the floods and smart enough to build your barn on the high ground, you would eventually own some of the most productive soil in the county. It took August 11 years to prove he was right. By 1914, the Martin farm was producing corn yields that other farmers in the county came to look at, the way people go to look at something they don't quite believe. August had a son named Harold, and Harold had a son named Raymond, and Raymond had 2 children, a daughter named Connie and a son named Dale. Raymond was the one who farmed the land through the hard years, through the 1970s when the banks were telling every farmer in Iowa to expand or get out, through the early 1980s when the same banks came back and said they wanted their money. Raymond Martin was 61 years old in 1985 when the operating loan came due, and the land values had collapsed, and the numbers stopped working no matter how many times he ran them. He died of a heart attack in January of 1986, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bank statements in front of him, and the farm passed to his 2 children who had not farmed a day in their adult lives. Let me tell you about Dale and Connie Martin, because the story of what happened to that farm runs directly through who they were and what they didn't know. Dale was 34 years old and worked as a sales manager for a farm equipment dealership in Dubuque. He understood farming the way a man who sells fishing rods understands fishing. He knew the vocabulary. He knew the products. He did not know the land. Connie was 31 and lived in Cedar Rapids and had a job doing bookkeeping for a trucking company. She was practical and organized and had spent the last year watching her father drown in debt, and she wanted the whole thing resolved. When Raymond died and the estate went through probate, and the accountant sat them down and explained what was owed against what the land was worth in 1986, the number that came back was not good. The farm carried $47,000 in operating debt. The land, at 1986 prices, was worth somewhere between $400 and $500 per acre, which meant the whole 160 acres might sell for $64,000 to $80,000 on a good day. And after the debt was cleared and the estate taxes were settled, Dale and Connie were looking at splitting somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 for a farm that their great-grandfather had built from nothing over 80 years. The realtor's name was Bud Schaefer, and Bud told them he had a buyer who would take the whole property, land, buildings, and equipment for $40,000 cash, close in 30 days, no inspection contingencies. Bud said in this market that was a serious offer, and they should take it seriously. Connie thought they should take it. Dale wasn't sure, and that is where the story stood on the Tuesday morning in March when Gerald Kowalski sat in his truck at the end of the driveway and looked at the for sale sign with the number on it that made his stomach turn. Now, let me tell you about Gerald Kowalski, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next. Gerald was 71 years old in 1987. He had farmed the 240 acres adjacent to the Martin property since 1951, when he came back from Korea with a bad knee and a Purple Heart, and used his savings and a GI loan to buy the ground his father had rented for 20 years. He was not a tall man or a loud man. He wore the same style of canvas work jacket every day from October through April, and he drove a 1974 Ford pickup that had 190,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield that he had been meaning to fix since 1981. He had been married to a woman named Irene for 44 years, and they had 3 sons, all of whom had left Dubuque County for jobs in cities, which Gerald understood and did not complain about, though Irene sometimes did. Gerald had watched the Martin farm his entire adult life. He had helped Raymond Martin pull a combine out of a ditch in 1967. He had sat with Raymond in the hospital waiting room in 1974 when Raymond's wife had her gallbladder out. He had watched Raymond get the operating loan in 1979 and had thought at the time that it was too much money for too much ground, but he had not said so because it was not his place, and he had stood at Raymond's funeral in January of 1986 and shaken Dale's hand, and told him that if there was anything he could do, he meant it. What Gerald knew, and what Dale and Connie did not know, was that the Martin barn was not just a barn. Let me tell you about the Martin barn because it is the center of this whole story. The barn had been built by August Martin in 1911, with lumber milled from timber on the property and the help of every neighboring farmer within 5 miles. It was a bank barn, built into the side of the high ground, so that the upper level was accessible from grade on the uphill side and the lower level open to the barnyard on the downhill side. The upper level had held hay and grain for 76 years. The lower level had held cattle and horses, and then, as the Martin operation shifted to row crops in the 1960s, it had held equipment. But the lower level had a sublevel, a full basement, dug into the limestone bedrock by August Martin himself in the summer of 1911, accessible through a heavy oak door set into the floor of the lower level, fitted with iron hardware that August had made himself at the blacksmith shop he kept in a shed behind the barn. Raymond Martin had told Gerald about the basement in 1972, after a few beers at the county fair. He had told him that his father, Harold, had told him about it, and that Harold had told him that August had built it for a specific purpose, which was to store the things that mattered most in a place that no banker, no tax assessor, and no tornado could easily reach. Raymond had laughed when he said it, the way men laugh about things their fathers did that they found eccentric but secretly respected. Gerald had never told anyone else about the basement. Not Irene. Not his sons. It was not his secret to tell. After he drove home from the end of the Martin driveway on that Tuesday morning in March, Gerald sat at his own kitchen table for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Dale Martin's number in Dubuque. Dale answered on the third ring. Gerald told him who he was and said he'd like to come over to the farm and look at a few things before Dale made any decisions about the sale. Dale said he appreciated the call, but the deal was pretty much decided. Gerald said he understood that, but he'd known Raymond for 35 years, and there were some things about the property that Dale might not be aware of. There was a pause on the line. Dale said he could meet him out there on Saturday. Let me tell you about that Saturday, because it was the morning that changed everything. It was cold and clear, the kind of March morning in Iowa where the sky's the color of a blue enamel pot and the ground is still frozen 2 inches down, but the mud is starting to work its way up from underneath. Gerald arrived first and parked his truck by the barn. Dale arrived 20 minutes later in a clean Chevrolet Suburban with Connie in the passenger seat, which Gerald had not expected but was glad for. They shook hands in the barnyard. Dale was wearing a Carhartt jacket that still had the tags on it, and Gerald noticed this without saying anything. Gerald led them to the lower level of the barn. The equipment was still there, Raymond's old machinery sitting in the dark the way equipment sits when the man who operated it is gone, patient and cold and waiting for something that isn't coming. Gerald walked to the center of the floor and pointed at the oak door set into the limestone. Dale looked at it and said he'd never noticed that before. Connie crouched down and looked at the iron hardware and said it looked old. Gerald said it was from 1911. He pulled the door open and found the wooden stairs going down and said, "Do you have a flashlight?" Dale went back to the Suburban and came back with a flashlight, and the three of them went down the stairs into August Martin's basement. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room that someone built with their hands to hold the things they cared most about, and felt the weight of every year that had passed since they built it? That is what that basement was. It was not large, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling of rough-cut limestone that August had chiseled out himself, and a floor of packed clay that was still dry after 76 years, because August had understood drainage the way he understood everything else, which was completely. And in that room, arranged with the kind of careful order that speaks of a man who thought about where things went and why, were the contents of 84 years of the Martin family's most careful keeping. Gerald let Dale and Connie look. He stood back by the stairs and held his own flashlight and watched their faces. Along the north wall there were tools. Not just any tools. August Martin's blacksmithing equipment, complete and intact, the anvil and the swage block and the hardies and the tongs and the hammers, every piece of it in the condition of something that had been oiled and wrapped and put away by someone who expected to come back for it. The anvil alone, a 350-pound Fisher Eagle that August had brought from Wisconsin in 1903, was worth more than Gerald was going to say out loud in that moment. Along the east wall there were wooden crates, and in the crates, wrapped in oilcloth, were the things that August and Harold and Raymond had considered worth protecting. There were documents, deeds, and letters, and a ledger book that turned out to be August's farm journal going back to 1903, written in a precise German-inflected hand that recorded every planting, every yield, every price received, every debt incurred and retired for 22 years of farming. There were photographs, dozens of them, in frames and in envelopes going back to the 1890s. And along the west wall, covered in canvas tarps that had been folded with military precision, were the machines. Let me tell you about the machines, because this is where the story turns from a story about a family into a story about what a man can accomplish when he decides that some things are worth keeping. August Martin had not only been a farmer, he had been a mechanic, a blacksmith, and a collector of mechanical equipment in the way that men of his generation sometimes were, which is to say, not as a hobby, but as a practical philosophy. He believed that a machine built to do a job correctly was worth more than the sum of its parts, and that the correct response to a machine that still worked was to maintain it, not replace it. Under those canvas tarps, Dale and Connie Martin found 4 pieces of equipment that August had acquired between 1905 and 1928, and that Harold and Raymond had maintained in running condition because that was what you did with something your father left you. There was a 1914 International Harvester Type A cream separator, complete and functional, the kind of equipment that dairy operations had used before electrification, worth to a collector what a decent used car was worth. There was a 1921 John Deere Model D tractor, one of the first production year models, with 847 hours on the original engine, running on steel wheels, the green paint faded to a color like old sage, the brass fittings on the magneto catching Dale's flashlight and throwing it back. There was a 1908 Advance Roomley threshing machine separator, a piece of equipment so large and so complete that Gerald had not known it was down there, and had to revise his understanding of how August Martin had managed to get it through that door, which turned out to be a question with an interesting answer that they found later. And in the corner, under its own separate tarp, was the thing that Gerald had actually come to tell them about. The thing that Raymond had described to him at the county fair in 1972, in the same tone of voice a man uses when he is telling you about something he doesn't fully understand, but knows is important. It was a steam traction engine. A 1906 Case 110 horsepower steam traction engine, the kind of machine that had broken the prairie and powered the threshing operations of the entire Midwest for 30 years before gasoline engines made them obsolete. It was 14 feet long and weighed 11 tons, and it was sitting in the basement of a barn in Dubuque County, Iowa, in complete condition, with the original firebox and boiler intact, the brass whistle on the steam dome polished to a shine that had no business being that bright after 81 years, and a handwritten tag wired to the throttle lever in August Martin's handwriting that said, in German and then in English, "This machine is in working order. Keep it that way." Dale Martin sat down on the clay floor of that basement and did not say anything for a long time. Connie was the one who finally spoke. She asked Gerald what it was worth. Gerald said he wasn't an appraiser, but he knew that a 1906 Case steam traction engine in running condition was the kind of thing that showed up at the Midwest Old Threshers reunion in Mount Pleasant and stopped traffic, and that the last one he had heard of selling had gone for somewhere north of $80,000 at an estate auction in Nebraska in 1984. Connie did the arithmetic in her head, and Gerald watched her do it. Dale was still sitting on the floor. Gerald told them there was more. He walked them through the rest of the basement. The blacksmithing tools, the John Deere Model D, the cream separator, the threshing machine separator. He had done some rough research before coming, calling a man he knew who dealt in antique farm equipment out of Waterloo, and the numbers he had been given were conservative, but they were real. The John Deere Model D alone, in that condition with that hour count, was worth between $12,000 and $18,000. The blacksmithing outfit, complete and functional, was worth between $8,000 and $14,000 to the right buyer. The threshing machine separator, if it could be moved and if it was complete, which it appeared to be, was worth between $15,000 and $25,000. The cream separator was the least valuable of the lot, but it was still worth $2,000 to $3,000 to a collector. And the steam engine was the crown of it. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in that basement. Dale and Connie called Bud Schaefer that afternoon and told him they were withdrawing the property from sale. Bud was not happy. The buyer he had lined up was a land investment company out of Des Moines that had been buying distressed farm properties throughout eastern Iowa, and they had been counting on the Martin farm as part of a larger package. Bud told Dale that the market wasn't going to get better and they were making a mistake. Dale told Bud that he appreciated his time and hung up the phone. They hired an appraiser out of Iowa City who specialized in antique agricultural equipment. He came out in April, spent 2 full days in the basement, and produced a written appraisal that Dale kept in a fireproof lockbox for the rest of his life. The total appraised value of the equipment in the basement, conservatively estimated for insurance purposes, was $187,000. The steam engine alone appraised at $94,000. The John Deere Model D appraised at $16,500. The blacksmith and outfit appraised at $11,200. The threshing machine separator, which turned out to be complete down to the original drive belts, appraised at $22,000. The cream separator appraised at $2,800. There were also the documents and photographs, which the appraiser did not value for insurance purposes but noted as historically significant, and which Dale subsequently donated to the State Historical Society of Iowa, where August Martin's farm journal is still held in their agricultural collection and is occasionally cited by historians studying early 20th century farming practices in the upper Midwest. The farm did not sell for $40,000. The farm did not sell at all. Let me tell you about what Dale Martin did next, because it matters to the rest of the story. Dale quit his job at the equipment dealership in June of 1987. He moved into the farmhouse on the Martin property in August. He had no farming experience worth speaking of, but he had a neighbor named Gerald Kowalski who had farmed the adjacent ground for 36 years, and who was willing, for reasons that were partly practical and partly something harder to name, to spend time with a man who was trying to learn something that most people in his situation would have walked away from. Gerald did not charge Dale for his time. He did not make a formal arrangement. He simply appeared, the way neighbors appear in rural Iowa, when there was something that needed doing and Dale didn't know how to do it. Dale planted his first crop in the spring of 1988. It was not a good crop. The yields were poor and the timing was wrong, and he made the kind of mistakes that a man makes when he is learning something that takes a lifetime to learn. But the land was the same land that August Martin had chosen in 1903 because it flooded every third year and laid down new topsoil, and the land did not care that Dale was a beginner. It produced what it produced, and Dale paid his bills, and he came back the next year and did better. The steam engine stayed in the basement for 3 more years while Dale figured out the question of how August had gotten it there in the first place. The answer, when he found it, was characteristically August. The barn had been built around the engine. August had acquired the Case 110 in 1906, positioned it on the site, and then constructed the barn over and around it, with the basement built to fit the machine's dimensions, and the oak door in the floor sized for a man to get in and out, but not for the machine to leave. August had not intended the engine to leave. He had intended it to stay, to be maintained, to be kept in the condition of something that might be needed again, in the same way that August had intended everything he built to last beyond his own need for it. Dale eventually had the north wall of the basement professionally opened and the steam engine removed in 1990, a process that took a structural engineer, a rigging crew from Dubuque, and 11 hours of careful work. The engine went to the Midwest Old Threshers reunion that year, where it was demonstrated under steam for the first time in 47 years, and drew a crowd that the reunion organizers said was the largest single-exhibit crowd they had recorded. Dale was offered $110,000 for it that weekend by a collector from Minnesota. He did not sell it. He brought it home and put it in the barn, in the lower level this time, where it sits today under a clean canvas tarp, maintained on the same schedule that August Martin wrote out in his farm journal in 1928, and that Harold copied into his own journal in 1951, and that Raymond copied into his in 1969, and that Dale has continued in a spiral notebook he bought at the Farm and Fleet in Dubuque in 1990. Let me tell you about Gerald Kowalski, one last time, because he deserves it. Gerald farmed his 240 acres until 1994, when his bad knee finally made it impossible to do the physical work of farming without help he didn't want to ask for. He sold his ground to Dale Martin at a price that his own sons thought was too low and that Gerald thought was exactly right. He and Irene stayed in the farmhouse on the Kowalski property until Gerald died in 2001 at the age of 85, and Irene stayed on until 2009 when she went to live with her youngest son in Ames. Gerald's funeral was at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Dubuque, and Dale Martin was a pallbearer. There were 340 people at the service, which was more than the church held comfortably, and the priest had to open the side doors so that the people standing outside could hear. Dale spoke at the graveside. He said that Gerald Kowalski had made a phone call in March of 1987 that had saved a farm, and that the phone call had cost Gerald nothing and had given Dale everything, and that he had spent a long time trying to understand what kind of man does something like that, and that the answer he had come to was a simple one, which was that Gerald was the kind of man who paid attention to what was happening around him and did not require a reason to help beyond the fact that help was needed. Now let me tell you about what happened in 2019, because the story doesn't end with Gerald. Dale Martin's son, a man named August Martin II, named for his great-great-grandfather with the full weight of intention that the name carried, was farming the combined Martin-Kowalski ground by 2019, 400 acres of Dubuque County bottomland that had been in continuous cultivation by the same family in an unbroken line for 116 years. He was 34 years old, the same age his father had been when Gerald made that phone call, and he had grown up in the basement of the barn, which is a way of saying that he had spent his childhood in the presence of the things his great-great-grandfather had kept and his father had preserved, and he understood in his bones what they meant. In the spring of 2019, a man from a land investment company came to the farm and made August a cash offer for the property. The company was different from the one that had approached Dale in 1987, but the logic was the same, which is the logic of people who see land as an asset rather than a place, and who believe that the right number will loosen any attachment. The man was professional and polite, and he had done his research and he knew the assessed value of the property, and he made an offer that was fair by the standards of people who measure fairness in dollars. August Martin II listened to the entire presentation. He asked several questions. He thanked the man for his time. Then he took the man out to the barn and showed him the lower level and he pulled back the canvas tarp on the 1906 Case 110 horsepower steam traction engine, and he showed the man the handwritten tag still wired to the throttle lever in August, Martin the First's handwriting, the one that said, in German and then in English, "This machine is in working order. Keep it that way." The man from the investment company looked at the engine for a long time. He said it was impressive. August said it was more than impressive. He said it was a set of instructions. The man left without a signed agreement. He did not come back. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing that stays with me about this whole story. When the appraiser came out in April of 1987 and spent 2 days in the basement and produced his report, he asked Dale how it was possible that a family had maintained a steam traction engine in running condition for 81 years in a basement in Iowa without anyone knowing about it. Dale told him about August's philosophy, about the barn being built around the engine, about the maintenance schedule in the farm journal, about Raymond telling Gerald at the county fair in 1972. The appraiser listened to all of it, and then he said something that Dale wrote down in the spiral notebook he later used for the maintenance schedule. The appraiser said that, in his experience, the things that lasted were never the things that were built to impress people. They were always the things that were built to work, maintained by people who understood that the work was the point, and passed to people who had been taught, by example rather than by instruction, that some things were worth the trouble of keeping. The Martin farm is still there. The steam engine is still in the lower level of the barn that was built around it in 1911. The maintenance schedule is still being followed. August Martin II has a daughter who is 7 years old and who already knows how to read a pressure gauge, because her father showed her how, the same way his father showed him, the same way Raymond showed Dale in the years before the debt and the heart attack, the same way Harold showed Raymond, the same way August showed Harold on a morning in Dubuque County more than 100 years ago, when the world was younger and the barn was new, and a man with a philosophy about what was worth keeping was just beginning to show his family what he meant. The investment company sent a second letter in 2021. August Martin II used it to light the firebox. That's what happens when a man builds something not for the world he lives in, but for the world he believes his grandchildren will need, and when the people who come after him are wise enough to understand that what looks like an old machine in a dark basement is actually a letter written in iron and brass and steam, addressed to anyone who has the patience to read it, saying that some things were not built to be sold, and some ground was not bought to be flipped, and some families do not measure what they have in the currency of people who have never had to decide what is worth keeping and what is worth